In the previous part, we went through finishing off the attachments to the main central machine. In this section, we'll be finishing all the modelling of the other objects off, including the conveyor belt, low poly crystals, rocks and ceiling cables. So congratulations, after this you'll have enough modelling ability to take on your own environment modelling challenges. I'll start with a breakdown of what to expect in this section and some of the key tools and ideas used. We'll start with creating instances by sharing object data with Control L and choosing object data. Then we'll be on to the conveyor belt. Next up, it'll be the rock and crystal objects, where we'll take a look at the flatten contrast sculpt brush. Then we'll slice objects with the bisect tool. Make a note that we can perform a trackball rotation style by pressing R twice. Next we'll move on to the top cables and block attachment, then to the tunnel support struts. We can duplicate a linked copy, or in other words create an instance with Alt-D. Then we'll be on to the valve wheel object. We can extrude individual faces from the Alt-E menu. Then we'll work on the large power cable, the light fixture, and then we'll be extending the cave tunnels. Finally, we'll use Shift-F for using Blender's awesome first-person viewing mode, which comes with a lot of extra options that you'll see laid out in the header bar. That will allow us to finish off by viewing our finished environment as we might experience it with game controls. So now, without further ado, let's pass it over to Martin to walk us through to the end.
Okay, over in the Layers tab, I've hidden all of my layers except for the pipes layer. And before I begin, I want to go to my character layer, where I have this T section saved that I made earlier. And I'm going to move that to the pipes layer by clicking this dot icon in the layer management. And with that done, I'm going to bring this over here. And what we're going to do in this case, rather than making changes to the geometry here and then duplicating copies of that to replace the blockout geometry, what I can do instead is select the straight pipe and then the bend. And I'm just going to duplicate that and bring that out. And for these three objects, I can make changes to them and have that data, that object data, shared with the objects in this arrangement of pipes. So, for example, if I make changes to the geometry on this straight section, we can make it so that all of the straight copies here will receive those changes as well. So first I want to prepare these objects a little bit. I'm going to select this bend and move it over here. Just to show you that there's a relationship line, because this bend is a child of the straight. So I'm going to undo that, and then I'm going to press Alt and P and bring up the clear parent menu, and I'm going to choose clear but keep transformation to leave it where it is. Next I'm going to shift select the straight, and in my tool tab I'm going to choose join. So now I want to reshape this geometry, so I'm going to go into edit mode and begin by cutting an edge in the center of this straight. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R and then click and right click to leave it in the center. And then I'm going to press Ctrl B to bevel it, and I'm going to move these out to near the ends of the straight section. And now I want to cut another edge in the center, so Ctrl R and then click and then right click again. And now I want to cut another edge loop in the bottom and the top of this bend, so I'm going to press Ctrl and R and then click and slide it so it's roughly the same distance away from that central edge there. And if I look at this factor value here, 0.575, if I now go ahead and cut another edge in the top here with Ctrl and R, I can click and leave that in place and change that to negative 0.575, and that will be the same, so it's even on both sides. So now I want to select these edges I've just made. I'm going to add to that selection at the top there with Alt and Shift and right click on these edge loops, and then this one at the end. And I want to scale them up, but before I do, I need to change my pivot to median again, and then I can press Alt and S, and then holding Shift I can just bring that up a little bit just to give the pipes a bit more of an interesting silhouette. And while I have these selected, I can press Ctrl and E and then mark those as sharp. And now I'm ready to separate these off into separate objects again. So I can drop my current selection and then hover over the straight and press L to select linked, and then I can press P for the separate menu and then separate that off into its own object. So now I can go into object mode and select each of them and apply smoothing, and then auto smooth in the data context. And now I'm ready to share this object data with these objects in the arrangement of pipes. So I'm going to begin with the bends. I'm going to select all of the bends down here to start with, and then finally select the one I've just worked on. And after that I can press Ctrl and L which will bring up the Make Links menu, and I can choose Object Data. So now all of that data is shared amongst all of these objects. And just to show you, if I select this one again and go into edit mode, if I make a further change to this, move some geometry around for example, all of those changes will appear on all of these other objects as well. So back in object mode, I'm going to select all of the straights and repeat the process there. And then finally select the one I've just created and then press Ctrl and L again and then choose Object Data. So finally for the pipes, I need to make changes to this T section, and rather than modelling edges in and trying to match what I've got here, instead I'm thinking it's going to be quicker to just remake it using this straight section as a base. So I'm going to duplicate that and move it along the x-axis, and I'm going to clear this rotation value in the Z field to be 0, and then I can go into my front view and I'm just going to quickly remake the T section. So I'm going to go into wireframe and then duplicate this with Shift D and then move it along the x-axis and hold Control so that it snaps to the central point. And then I want to rotate this, so R90, and I actually want the central point of this pipe to be snapped down here. So I'm going to go into edit mode and select everything and then hold Control and click on the blue arrow and snap it so the central point is in the middle of this horizontal pipe. And then in face mode I can drop my current selection and select the bottom half and then press X and then delete those faces. So now back in object mode, I'm going to select this horizontal pipe and go over to my modifiers and create a new boolean, and then using the eyedropper I'm going to select this vertical section and then change the operation to union. So now when I apply that, I can select this vertical segment and delete it. So looking at it in solid view, you can see it's got some shading issues, and that's because I've got some vertices that need merging. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then vertex mode and then select everything and then press Ctrl V and then choose remove doubles. And while I'm here, I want to make these angled edges sharp. So I'm going to Alt and right click and then Shift and Alt and then press Ctrl E and mark sharp. So I'm just going to check it in object mode. I think that's okay. And so now I'm ready to share this object data with the T sections down here. So I'm going to select these first and then shift select the one I've just made and then press Ctrl and L again and then choose object data. And now you can see those T sections are the same as the one I've just made. So working in this way is quite useful if you have multiple copies of the same object. Later on when I unwrap these ready for texturing, I can just work on these ones over here and all of those changes will be shared amongst all of these objects down here. So for now I'm going to select these pipes and move them to a different layer. I'm going to go to my layers tab and I'm going to use this ref cube layer as a general reference layer. So I'm going to click on this dot icon and then I'm going to select and delete this T section I no longer need. And I think that's pretty much it for the modelling of the pipes. So moving on then, I want to show the layer with the conveyor sections on it, and I'm going to hide the pipes, and I'm going to use this similar method of sharing data across objects to work on these different sections. So I'm going to make some changes to one of these segments and later on share that data across all of them. So I'm going to hide everything else for now. I'm going to press Shift and H and then press my decimal point key to focus on this object. And I don't need to do very much to this because it's quite an angular object anyway. I'm probably just going to add a bevel to the outer edges here. So in edit mode, I'm going to drop my current selection and go into edge mode. And I want to Alt and right click and then Shift and Alt these edges here on both sides. And then I just want to bevel those. So Control B and then just hold down Shift just to give it a bit more shape, and I think that will pretty much do. I've got some n-gons down here, but because these things rest on the ground I can just delete these faces. So I can go to face mode and then select each of those and then just press X and delete them. Okay, so back in object mode I'm going to press Alt and H and bring everything back, and I'm going to select all of my other strut objects and then finally select the one I've just worked on, and then press Ctrl and L, and then choose Object Data. So now all of those bevels are propagated through that group. For the track objects, I'm not really going to do very much to those either. What I'm going to do is link those objects together, so I've got one segment that's repeated, and I'm going to apply some smoothing to the corner segments so that these edges down here are soft. So first of all, I'm going to select this object and hide everything else, and then focus on it with my decimal point key. And mainly I'm going to delete some faces. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select these faces on the underside because they're resting on the ground, so I don't need those. And I can press X and delete them. And then I can also select the faces at the ends of the segment and delete those as well. Back in object mode, I can press Alt and H and bring everything back. I'm going to select all of my other track objects except the corner ones, just these straights. And then finally shift select this one I've just worked on, and then press Ctrl and L, and then choose Object Data. So now all of those changes have been added to these straights. So I'm going to do something similar with the corners. I'm going to select that one and press Shift and H, and I want to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select these faces at the ends and then delete them. And then I'm going to select the faces on the underside, but in this case I'm going to go into my front view and wireframe, and I'm going to do a box select just to speed things up a little bit, and then I can press X and delete those. So back in my solid view, I want to apply smoothing to this to stop these edges being hard at these divisions. So I'm going to go into edge mode, and I'm going to select the edges running along the length of the segment, and I'm going to mark those as sharp. So Control E, mark sharp, and then in object mode I'm going to go to my tools tab and apply my smooth shading and my auto smooth, and then I'm going to press Alt and H, bring everything back, and I'm going to select the other corner segment and then shift select the one I've just worked on, and then press Ctrl and L and choose Object Data. And that's pretty much it for the conveyor belt. It is very simple, and looking back at the concept, we do have this kind of wavy force field which kind of sits on top, and I think I'd like to keep the conveyor belt quite simple as it is in the concept. Next I'm going to look back at my model list that I had at the beginning, and I'm going to work through the other more minor objects and make those and finish off the scene. So looking in the natural section, I've got the rock samples, so I'm going to start with those, and I'm going to make a rock. And I'm going to make two crystals with this hexagonal shape, one with a point at the end and another one with the point kind of cut off at an angle, and using those I can make these arrangements of crystals with the rocks. So back in Blender I'm going to make this rock, and to begin with I'm going to move to my next available empty layer, and I want to move my 3D cursor back to the origin with Shift and C, and I'm going to start off with a cube, so I'm going to do Shift and A and Mesh Cube. And as before, I'm going to use the sculpting tools to make a natural rock shape. So I'm going to move into sculpting mode. I'll just resize this. And as before, I want to enable dynamic topology, so I'm going to switch that on. And I want to begin with a reasonable amount of detail in my geometry. If I just go into wireframe, you can see that a default cube only has 12 triangles. So I want to start off with a bit more than that. So I'm going to move to my settings for dynamic topology, and I'm set to constant detail. And I want to change this detail size to, let's try 50. And then I want to use detail flood fill, and that'll give me an idea about how dense that level of detail is going to make my object. And I think that will do to start with. So I'm going to move back to my solid view, and as before I'm just going to use the standard brush and use Shift and Control as toggles to knock off some of the corners of the cube and make a more natural kind of rocky shape. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, and then holding Shift to activate my smooth, I'm just going to start making a shape out of this cube. And I'm not following the concept particularly closely, I'm just making what I think works as a basic kind of boulder shape. So here and there, just to create a bit of an indentation, I'm using Control to use the brush to push inwards on the mesh and then smoothing that off. And I think that's not too bad. I think here and there what I'm going to do is switch to the flatten brush, which will give me the opportunity to flatten off some of the surfaces and make it seem a bit more angular. And now that I've started doing that, I don't think the level of detail I've got is quite enough. I'm just going to go quickly into wireframe. Now I could do with having a little bit more detail, so I'm going to change my detail size to let's try 30. And now if I go back to wireframe and use the detail flood fill again, it's added a little bit more, and I think that will do. So I'm just going to use the smooth brush, the flatten brush, just to flatten off a couple of surfaces and hopefully make it seem a bit more rock-like and a bit less blobby. And yeah, I think that's a decent start. I think that will do for now. I can reshape this later, but for now, yeah, I think that's okay. Okay, so next I want to create my crystal. So I'm going to go to object mode and hide this for now. And I'm going to begin my crystal with a cylinder. And if I just resize these options, I want to change the vertices value to 6, which will make it hexagonal. And I'm going to change the cap fill type to triangle fan. And next I want to go into my front view and frame my selection with the decimal point key. And I want to go into edit mode and move all of this geometry up 1 unit. So I'm going to press G, Z, 1, and that makes the origin sit nicely at the bottom of the object. So next in vertex mode, I'm going to select this vertex in the center of the top of the object. I'm going to move that up to create this pointed shape. And next I'm going to press Ctrl and plus on the number pad to expand my selection, and then move all of those up a little bit more to something like that. Next I can press Ctrl and I to invert the selection, and then press S to scale all of those vertices down and taper the object as a whole. And that's pretty much all I need to do for the crystal. I think most of the interest here is going to come through in the texture, so I'm going to keep the geometry quite simple. And so next I want to make a variation of this. I'm going to go into object mode, and I'm going to duplicate this and move it along the X-axis. So Shift and D and then X. And then I'm going to select the original one and go back to my front view. And next I want to take this one and chop off the top pointed area. So to do that I'm going to go into edit mode and drop my selection and then select everything. And then in my tools tab I've got a tool here called bisect. So I'm going to click on that, and if I click outside the object and then move my mouse, I can see that I've got this kind of guideline showing where the tool is going to slice through the object. So I'm going to leave it at kind of an angle like that. And looking at the options for this, I can use clear inner or clear outer depending on which part of the object I want to discard. So if I choose clear outer, I think that removes the top, and if I was to choose clear inner, it would remove the opposite part instead. And it also leaves this open, so I can click on this fill option here to create a face. And I think that will do. I'm just going to move this up to make it a bit taller. And while I've got this selected, I can press Alt and P to poke that larger n-gon into triangles. Next I'm going to create copies of my rocks and crystals and place them in the scene. And I'm going to begin with the one in the center of the force field in the middle of the machine. So taking a closer look at that, I've got a rock sample and 3 pointed crystals sticking out of the top and one of the other crystals sticking out of the bottom. So going back into Blender, I'm going to go into object mode and unhide the rock from before, and I'm going to make copies of these and duplicate them and move them out of the way. And as we did with the pipes, when I want to make changes to these later on after I've placed them in the scene, I'm going to share the object data from these objects with the ones that I do place. So first of all, I'm going to go to my layers tab and show the cavern, and I'm going to duplicate and then move these objects along the Y, and then these will be the ones that I refer to later. So for now I'm going to hide those and then hide the cavern again. And first of all, you can see that the crystals are much bigger than the rock, so I'm going to scale those down, and I'm going to move this one out of the way for now. And looking at the concept again, you can see that the one in the center is quite small compared to this one on the right, and the one on the left is about halfway between. So going back in, I'm going to select the pointed one and place it roughly in the middle, and then scale it down, and then duplicate it, and then rotate it along the x-axis, and then scale this one up quite a bit. And then make another copy on the left. And I'm actually going to rotate the rock as well, I think. So I'm going to press R and then X. Just make that point upwards a bit more. And then just make sure that these ones are properly embedded. Something like that. And one thing you can see here is that all of the crystals are kind of quite neatly aligned, and I want a bit more random rotation on these. So one thing I can do, if I press R, it will bring me my standard rotation, but if I press R again, the cursor changes into this green and red arrow icon, and it gives me more of a kind of a trackball type rotation on the object. So I can use that to bring in a bit more randomness. Bit too random on that one, I think. I think that's okay. So next I'm going to choose this other crystal and move it into place, and I want to rotate this one so it's facing downwards, and then embed that one in the rock as well. And looking at the concept, the angle on this is on the left there, so I'm going to rotate it on the z-axis and also scale it down a little bit. And then do a bit of a rotation just to make it seem a bit more random and natural. Yeah, I think that will do. Okay, so now I want to select the other crystals and then finally the rock, and I'm going to parent these together. So I'm going to press Ctrl and P and then choose Object. So now I want to place this in the center of the machine, so I'm going to bring back my machine layer. And the force field itself is opaque at the moment, so I want to hide that. I'm going to select it and press H, and then I can select the rock and move that roughly into place, and I need to scale this down, so scale it to something like that, and then I can press Alt and H and bring back the force field, and you can see here that the crystal is still sticking out just a little bit there, so I can press S again. No, I can't because I've got the force field selected. So I'm going to go into wireframe and select the rock, and then go back into solid view and scale it down. Something like that. So now if I look at it in wireframe, it's about as large as it can be in the space available. Next I want to create copies of these to lie along the length of the conveyor belt. And to help me do that, I'm first going to make the band of polygons that I need to represent this wavy force field. So what I'm going to do is go back in, and I'm going to go to my conveyor layer, and I want to select the objects that make up the track. And then I'm going to duplicate those and then right click to leave them in place. And then I want to go to my Tools tab and choose Join. So after that I'm going to go into edit mode and drop my current selection and then press A to select everything. And I want to merge the vertices together, so I'm going to press Ctrl and V and then choose Remove Doubles. So next I want to lift all of these up above the conveyor belt, and I need to select all of the faces that make up this vertical side on both sides. So I'm going to hold Ctrl and Alt and right click on one of the vertical edges and then go onto the inside of the track and then press Shift, Ctrl and Alt and select all of the others as well, and then I can press X and then choose Delete Faces. So next I want to select all of the vertices with A, and I want to make them flat. So I'm going to scale them in the Z axis with S and then Z, and then type 0 and press return. So now that they're all flat, I want to go into my front view and I want to move them down so that they're just above the struts that support the conveyor belt. And with that done, I want to create an extra edge loop running along the center, and that will help me place my objects a bit better. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R, and making sure I've got my cursor over one of these horizontal edges, you can see the line that it's going to cut into the center of the object. So I can then click and then right click to leave it in the center. So when I'm back in object mode, I can't see these edges. So to make it a bit easier on myself, I'm going to go to the object context, and I want to choose wire and draw all edges. And now I'm ready to snap copies of my crystals to the track. So I'm going to go back to the crystals in the center, and I want to select one of them. I want to select one of the pointed ones and the rock, and then this one at the bottom as well, and then duplicate those and just move them over here. And because these are parented, now that I've copied these, if I move this out of the way, you can see that this is actually parented to this copy of the rock. So I want to remove that parent relationship. So I'm going to select both the crystals and then press Alt and P to clear the parent and keep the transformations. And now I want to snap these objects to this new track object I've got here. So I'm going to press G and then hold Control to activate the snap. And I want to rotate this one and have it so that it's above the track. So I'm going to press R and X and just bring it up. And I'm just going to fairly roughly position these for now. And as long as they're floating just above the force field object, I think that's okay. So I want to do the same with the rock. Press G and then Control. I'm just going to frame this so I can see it a bit better. And I want to rotate this. Something like that. And I'm not going to use these reference objects, and I think they're going to get in the way as I rotate around. So I'm going to select those, and I'm just going to move those to an empty layer. Looking back at the concept, there aren't too many rock samples on the conveyor belt. There are 5 in total, and 3 of them have a crystal embedded in them, so I'll come back to those later. But I'm going to begin by placing these rocks, and I'm not going to worry too much about the exact position and rotation of these, as long as it fairly represents what's going on in the concept. I think that will do. So going back to Blender, I'm going to select my rock, and I'm going to create another copy and move it along the y-axis, and then select both of these and then move them further up, something like that. And that will represent these 2 here. And then I want to put 3 at the other end. So going back in, I'm going to select one of them and then duplicate it with Shift and D, and then press Control and then snap it to this vertex over here. So I'm going to move that up again. So now that I've got that in place, next I want to duplicate it again and then press X. And let's do that again with Shift and R. And now I've got 5 rock samples basically placed on the conveyor belt where I want them. But they've all got the same angle of rotation, so because we're using the same object, I want to bring in extra rotation here to make them look a bit different. And so what I'm going to do is select each one, and here and there I will scale them up, and also press R twice and rotate them around so they look a bit different. And each time I'm going to make sure that it's not intersecting this band of polygons that I've just made for the force field. One final rock sample to place though is the one that's sitting on this tray on the base of the machine. So going back into Blender, I'm going to go to my Layers tab and show the machine. And I want to duplicate a rock, and I think it's 2 pointed crystals. So I'm going to select that one and duplicate them, and then snap them to the tray, and then as before just position them basically in place. And then make a copy of the crystal, and the second one is quite a bit smaller, I think, so I'm just going to scale that one down, something like that. Okay, so next I'm going to hide the force field object, and I want to rotate the sample that's inside the force field so that it's facing the same direction as the concept. At the moment it's facing the wrong way. It needs to have all of the crystals laid out so you can see them from the front. So I'm just going to rotate that on the Z axis and bring that around to about here, something like that. Finally, for the crystals then, I want to make sure that they're all on the same layer. So I'm going to hide my conveyor and machine layers, and I'm going to shift click layer 6 where I put my reference objects earlier on, and then I'm going to drop my current selection and then press A to select everything, and then move those objects to layer 15 by clicking this dot icon, and then I can rename that layer crystal. So to create my cables I'm going to use a curve. And to start me off, I've hidden all of the other layers except for the machine layer, and I've also hidden most of the objects on that layer, and I've just got the top of the machine as a visual reference. So what I want to do next is go into my front view, and then I'm going to press Shift and A and create a new curve. I'm going to use a Bezier, and as before when we made the claw attachment with the curve object, it's going to be a pretty similar process to that. So I want to rotate and position the curve a bit better so that it's up here near the top of the machine. So first I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to do RX -90, and then in my front view again I'm just going to lift it up so it's roughly in the right position, and then press G and move it over here. And I want the end of the cable to be roughly in the center of this area, which is made up where these two surfaces meet, this smaller part of the machine and this larger part. So what I want to do is quickly create a basic shape and then use the mesh tools in the curve settings here to give me a tubular cable shape. So back in my front view, I want to create a cylinder which will be this kind of socket that the cable sits inside at the end of the machine. So I'm going to go into edit mode on my curve and select this vertex at the end, and then press Shift and S and move the cursor to that point. And then back in object mode I'm going to press Shift and A and then choose Mesh Cylinder, and that's now created at that point there. So what I want to do is reduce the vertices value. I think I can get away with 12, and I also want to change the cap fill type to triangle fan. So next I'm going to reduce the radius quite a bit to something like that, and I'll reduce the depth a little bit, but I can edit that in a moment. So in wireframe view, so I can see what's going on, I'm going to go into edit mode and select the vertices at the top with the box selection, and then press Ctrl and click on the blue arrow on the gizmo, and then snap those verts to that underside of that large part of the machine. And then I'm going to press Ctrl and I and invert my selection and move that up to about there. And next I want to add a division in this object to give it a bit more interest. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R and then click, and then slide that edge up to about here. Next I'm going to drop my current selection and go into face mode, and then select all of the faces at the top, and then press E to extrude, but then right click and leave it in place. And then I'm going to scale those down with S and then Shift Z to lock out the Z axis scaling, and just bring that into somewhere like there. Next I'm going to go into edge mode, and I want to drop my current selection and then Alt and right click on the edge loop at the bottom of this extrusion I've just made, and I just want to lift that up just to create this kind of angled shape at the top of this object, and I think that will do for that. Next thing I need to do is I'm going to leave that selection there and then press Shift and Alt and right click on the next edge loop down, and then again on the one at the bottom, and then I'm going to press Ctrl and E and mark sharp. And next I want to go back into object mode. Actually no, I need to select these faces at the top. So I'm going to go into my front view and then Control Tab into face mode and select the faces at the top there, and then I can press X and delete those. So back in my solid view, I want to go to object mode and enable auto smooth, and again as before I'm going to enable the smooth option in the tool tab. Okay, so that's the basic socket shape I've got, and now I need to adjust this curve a little bit to make it work well with this object. So back in my front view, I'm going to select the curve, and in wireframe view again I'm going to go into edit mode, and I've still got this vertex selected, and now I want to hold Control and click on the blue arrow on the gizmo and snap it to that vertex at the bottom of the cylinder so that it's flush. With that done, I want to give the curve a bit more shape. So the next thing I want to do is select the vertex at the other end and then press G and just move this up here, and that's going to be embedded in the ceiling of the cavern. So next I'm going to grab one of the handles and bring this curve down so it's a bit more of a gentle kind of hanging curve shape. I also want to grab the handle at the other end and make that come down to about here. Okay, so now that the curve is almost doing what I want, I can make some further changes in a moment. I'm going to go back to object mode and come over here to the data context, which has information about curves now. So the first thing I want to do is give this some geometry, some thickness. So in my bevel settings I can change the depth, and if I go into solid view you can see that by default it gives me this kind of half an object. It's kind of open at this end. So I can change the fill type from half to full, and now it looks more like a tube. So the next thing I want to do is make it have a bit more roundness. It's got 4 sides here, and that's because the bevel settings, the resolution is set to 0. So if I click that and change it to 1, I think 6 sides will do for this object. So the next thing I want to do is just apply a bit more shape and perhaps change the depth a little bit as well. So I'm going to change that to, let's see what 0.1 looks like. I think that's okay. But now where the curve object meets the socket, it's kind of angled and poking out. So what I want to do is go to my front view again and wireframe and then edit mode, and I just want to adjust this handle to make this edge of the curved object meet the cylinder more nicely. So I'm just going to grab the x-axis arrow on the gizmo and just move it so it's more like that. And it doesn't have to be perfect. If it's embedded slightly, it's okay, but you can usually get it fairly straight. Okay, so I can make changes to these later, and it would be nice in fact to make variations so that they're not all hanging in exactly the same way, because they'll meet the cavern ceiling at different points. So to create a bit more visual interest, I will be making changes to each of the cables after I've duplicated them. So I'm going to go back into object mode, and I want to select the socket object as well, and I want to duplicate these and rotate them around the center of the world. So I'm going to use the 3D cursor for this. I'm going to press Shift and C and move that back to the origin, and then I can choose the 3D cursor from the pivot point menu and then duplicate these with Shift and D and then R, Z, 90, and then press Shift and R again another couple of times, and I've now got my 4 cables ready to adjust. Object which connects to the ceiling of the cavern and attaches to the cable there, and there's one at the front of the scene and the corresponding one at the back, but the cables on the left and the right don't have them. So going back into Blender, first of all I'm going to bring back my cavern layer, and I've currently got it set to wireframe, so I'm going to click this wireframe material button and bring it back to be solid view. And while I'm here I'm going to click this padlock icon so I don't accidentally select the cavern object while I'm working. So next what I want to do is select this cable which is at the front of the scene, and if you're finding it difficult to orientate yourself, just bring back some of your other objects and it makes it easier to decide which cable to select and which one to work on. So with this one selected, I'm going to press Shift and S and move the cursor to that selection, and then from there I can press Shift and A and create a cube. And what I want to do is just roughly position this to represent the block. So I'm not going to move it on the x-axis because it's currently nicely centered on this cable. And while I'm here, actually, I'm going to change the pivot point back to median. And I just want to scale this down so it's a more appropriate size. I think something like that. And I want it so that it's embedded in the ceiling of the cavern. But you can see here on this side, because of the shapes in the geometry of the cavern, it doesn't actually embed here, whereas it does on this side. So what I'll do in the end is smooth off the ceiling of the cavern around these areas to accommodate this object. So next what I want to do is go into edit mode, and I want to cut an edge in the center of this object. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R and then click and then right click to leave that in the center. And I also want to create another edge on this side of the object. So again, Ctrl and R and then click and then right click. And from there I can click this edge and lower it down. And just looking back at the concept, if you look at this object, there's a kind of a beveled shape here with this angle, and that's the surface where the cable meets this block. But there's also this kind of angle here. So I want to represent that. I'm going to click this edge and bring this one down. I think something like that's okay. And then I want to select all of the vertices at the bottom of this. I'm going to go into wireframe and then go into vertex mode and drop my current selection. And then just box select all of the verts at the bottom and then move those up. I'll go back into solid view. And I want the cable to meet the object in the center of this face, or fairly close to it anyway. So when I come to adjust the cable, I'll be placing it so that the end is there. So for now, I think I'm just going to move this up a bit further and see how that looks with the cavern. And I think that's okay for the modeling of the object. It is very simple, but I've got a bit of cleanup to do. So I'm going to go into face mode and then select these faces at the top and then press X and delete them. And next I can go back into object mode, and now I'm going to make some quick changes to the ceiling of the cavern. So I'm going to unlock it by clicking the padlock icon and then select it. And as before, I want to go into sculpting mode. So I'm going to go to sculpt mode and just expand my options panel. And I want to enable dynamic topology. And I'm using constant detail as before. And my detail size is set to 30. So I'm going to use my eyedropper and I'm going to click somewhere on the surface of the cavern, and that's set to 11 at the moment. I'll just double check that. In perspective mode, I'm going to press 5 on my keypad because I don't want to be accidentally sampling the outside of the object. I want to be inside it. So I'm going to do that again and click the eyedropper, and it's actually about 7 around there. So just to give me the detail that I need here, I'm going to use the smooth brush mainly, but also if I change my normal brush to the sculpt draw brush, and I'm going to press shift and then smooth that surface down. And if you look at it in wireframe, the resolution here is a little bit low where I've pulled out this kind of bulge in the ceiling. So I just want to make sure that I don't have any nasty pointed angles around here as I pull this surface down to meet this cube object. So I'm going to click and draw, place some sculpting strokes around this area just to make this new object sit better in the scene. Yeah, I think that's okay. Maybe just a little bit more there. And a little bit more there. So yeah, I think that's fine. So now I'm going to go back into object mode. And I want to create a copy of this object on the opposite side. So I'm going to use my 3D cursor as a pivot for this. First of all though, I'm going to go back to my layers tab and I'm going to lock my cavern layer again. And I'm going to select this object that I've just made. And I want to press Shift and C to put the 3D cursor at the center of the world, and then change my pivot point back to 3D cursor. And then I want to duplicate this, so Shift D, and then R, Z, 180, and that will create a copy on the opposite side, and it almost meets this cable here. And as before, it's embedded in the ceiling. I'm just going to check that it's okay with the ceiling of the cavern. I think that's okay actually. I'm not going to do any further remodeling for the cavern here. So the next thing I need to do is make alterations to the curves of these cables to make them work better with these objects, and also that they're a bit different from each other. And I'll also do the same with these ones at the sides. Okay, so with the cables then, I'll work on this one at the back first. I want to select each object and then go into edit mode, and I just want to select the vertex at the end of the curve, and I need to change my pivot point back to median so I can see my gizmo. I just want to move this down so that it's embedded pretty much in the center of this angled face on this block, and I'm going to move it a bit closer and just adjust it to get it where I want it. And the fact that it's embedded in the block a little bit, that's fine. If need be, I can amend the geometry later anyway, but I think this will be okay. Okay, I think that one's okay. So next I want to go back to object mode and select this cable and then repeat the process. So I'm going to select the vertex at this end and move it down and place that roughly in the middle again. And I want it to be slightly different, so I'm going to grab one of these handles and just pull that further back, maybe bring it further down. Nothing too drastic, but just a little bit of variation. And then go back into object mode. I'm going to select the one at the left here, and the end of this cable doesn't actually meet the cavern because there's kind of an indentation there. So going into edit mode, I'm going to select this vertex and fix that so that it goes into the ceiling properly. Just need to frame my selection with my decimal point key, and I think that is okay actually. Alright, so now that I've made that quite steep, I want to grab one of these handles and bring it down, move it out. And then going back into object mode, I'm going to select the final one, and that's actually embedded into the cavern already, so I think I'm going to leave that one as is. Okay, so that will do for the placement of the cables. I could go ahead and make that into geometry now, but I think I may leave that in case I want to adjust them later. So the next thing I want to do is make the other objects in my model list, so bringing those back. I have the attachment blocks, the column, the armatures and the rest of the machine are made, and the main stand is made as well. Going down my list then, I have the conveyor belt made, and I now need to make the corridor struts, and they are these quite simple bits of geometry here. They shouldn't take too long to make. I've got these kind of support structures that support the cave entrances here, and I've also got this kind of strut that goes across and supports this light fixture. Okay, so zooming into the cave entrance with shift and control, you may see here I've got the conveyor belt, but it kind of ends at the entrance to the cave, and to create my strut I need to have the conveyor belt running down the cave and the tunnel to use as a visual reference, and also to complete the scene as well. So to begin with, I'm going to create those copies that I need. So I'm going to hide the bit of geometry for the force field, and what I want to do is duplicate some of the track objects and one or two of the struts to complete the conveyor belt. So in this case though, if I use the standard duplicate, the linking I have between these objects will be broken and it will be a unique copy. So if you look in the Tools tab, there's an option here underneath duplicate called duplicate linked. So I'm going to use that instead, and the shortcut key for it is Alt and D. So apart from that, it works in just the same way. So I'm going to press Alt and D and then create the copies and snap them end to end. So before I do, I want to change my snap element to increment so that it will snap nicely on the grid. And so then I can press Alt and D and then Y, and then holding Control, I can just snap that out to there. And as before, I can press Shift and R, and that will duplicate the previous operation. And to show you what I meant about the linked objects, if I go into edit mode for this, you can see that all of the conveyor sections are also going into edit mode as well, showing that they're still linked. Okay, so going back to object mode, what I want to do is duplicate this rail object in the same way. So for now, I'm going to go to my layers tab and hide my cavern layer, and I'm going to go into wireframe and then select this strut. And then I'm going to press Alt and D and then Y, and then hold Control and snap it to the point between these two track segments. Then I can press Shift R and create another one at the end. And with that done, I now want to create an object to be the beginnings of my strut. I'm going to start with a cube. So to place the cube properly, I'm going to select one of the track pieces, and I'm going to hide everything else with Shift and H, and then go into edit mode on this, and then go into vertex mode. And I want to select one of the verts at the bottom of the object which meets the floor, and then press Shift and S and move my cursor to the selection. And so back in object mode, I'm going to go into solid view. I want to press Shift and A and create a new cube. And then in edit mode on that, I want to press G, Z, 1, and that will place the geometry of the cube nicely on the floor so that it's flush with the level that the conveyor belt is at. So next I want to go into object mode and then scale this down so it's a more appropriate size. I think something like that. I can always change this later. And I'm just going to move this away from the conveyor belt track. And next I want to go into edit mode and then go into face mode and select the face at the top. And then I'm going to press E and extrude that up. And I don't worry too much about where this ends up for now. Again, I can change this stuff later. Next I want to go to edge mode, and I want to select this edge here that faces the conveyor belt track, and I want to snap it to the edge of the track so it's nice and clean. So I'm going to change my snap element to vertex, and then click and drag on the X arrow and snap it to the end there. Okay, next I'm going to go into object mode, and I'm going to show my cavern layer, and I'm going to show everything else with Alt and H, and then reselect my cube. I'm just going to make sure that the conveyor layer is the active one. And next I want to create a bit of a slant shape on this object. So I'm going to go into face mode and then select the face at the top and the two at the back. And then I'm going to click on the X arrow and move them a bit further along so that it creates this slanted shape. And just to reshape it as I go, I'm going to go into edge mode and select this edge here and move that along to create a more angled shape here. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the shape of the object. I want to move it away from this strut, so I need to place it around here, I think. So I'm going to go into object mode and just move that along. I think something like that's fine. Perhaps a little further, so it's roughly in the center of this segment. And next I want to create a duplicate of this on the other side. So the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to use this force field object we made earlier as a guide. I'm going to select that and go into edit mode, and there is an edge loop going along the center of it, which is also in the center of the conveyor belt. So I'm going to go into vertex mode and select the vertex at the end in the middle there, and then press Shift and S and move my cursor to that selection. And then back in object mode, I can select my strut and change my pivot point to 3D cursor. And as before, I want to create a linked duplicate this time. So I'm going to press Alt and D again, and then right click to leave that in place. And then I can press Control and M to mirror the object, and then press X, and then press return. And as you can see, it's created the copy on the other side, but it's almost fully embedded in the cavern, and that's okay because we're going to be reshaping the cavern to accommodate these objects later. Okay, so with that one still selected, I want to select the original, and I want to create more copies to place here. So I'm going to press Alt and D again, and then press Y to move them along the Y axis, and then just place them roughly in the middle of the next segment of track. So the next thing I want to do is create the horizontal strut which goes across the tunnel entrance here. Looking back at the concept, I think this strut at the top here is pretty similarly shaped to the strut I've got for the conveyor belt track. So I'm going to duplicate one of these objects and use that as a starting point for this one. So going back in, I'm going to select the track object, and I'm going to change my pivot point back to median. And I want to duplicate this, but not a linked copy this time, a standard duplicate. So I'm going to do Shift and D and then press Z and just move it up. And then I want to rotate it on the Y-axis 180 degrees, so R, Y, 180. And I want to scale it up a little bit to something like that, and then move it up so it's more appropriately positioned. And while I'm here, I'm going to do Shift, Control, Alt and C and move the origin to geometry just so it's centered a bit better in the object. And the strut here is embedded in the wall, and it will be on both sides even after we remodel the cavern. So what I'm going to do is go into edit mode and then face mode, and I want to select the faces at the ends of this object, and as before the cavern is kind of getting in my way a bit, so I'm going to go to my layers tab in object mode and then switch off my cavern, and then back in edit mode on this object I'm going to select the faces at the end with a box select and do the same at this end, and then press X and delete them. So back in object mode and solid view, I'm going to show my cavern again, and yeah, I think that will do. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is remodel the cavern a little bit to accommodate these new objects and just tidy up this area. So what I'm going to do is unlock my cavern layer and select the cavern object, and I want to use the sculpting tools as before just to reposition some of this geometry and make it look a bit nicer. So I'm going to go into sculpting mode, and in the tools tab I'm going to enable dynamic topology, and I'm going to use constant detail as before. I'm going to use the eyedropper and sample the geometry on this part of the tunnel here. So I'm going to go in and just use Control and Shift as before to smooth and push back some of this geometry, and let dynamic topology look after the topology for me. And again, as before, I want it to be a rocky surface, so I'm leaving it quite rough and just doing something that I think works. And also where the cavern meets the conveyor belt, I'm just pushing back on that geometry so that it's not overlapping the conveyor belt too much. I think that's okay. One thing I'm going to do though is move over to my mat cap and activate that. As I mentioned before, I just find that a bit easier to read. I think that's okay. Where I've got this horizontal strut now, I just want to make sure that that's fully embedded in the wall there. I think that's okay. And then doing the same on the other side. I can make my brush larger or smaller with F, just in case I need a bit more precision. And looking at it from outside, the strut on the left is a bit too buried, I think, so I'm going to push back a bit further on this side just to expose that a bit more. Again, just so it's a bit more like the concept. And yeah, I think that's okay. So I'm going to go back into object mode again, and I want to duplicate these objects now and place them at the other end of the conveyor belt to mirror what's going on inside this tunnel here. In order to help me position these objects properly, what I'm going to do first is work on this object that I made to create the force field for the conveyor belt. So I'm going to go back to my layers and lock my cavern again, and I'm going to select this, and I'm also going to select the track object at the end of the track, and I'm going to hide everything else with Shift and H. And what I'm going to do is extend this geometry off so that it snaps to the end of this track section here. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then edge mode, and I'm going to box select the edges at the end, and I want to press E for extrude and then Y for the Y axis, and then holding Control, I'm just going to snap it to the end of that object. And then to keep the divisions even, I'm going to press Control and R and then click and place a loop cut in the center, and then right click and leave it in place. So with that done, I'm going to go into vertex mode, and then I'm going to select this vertex in the center at the end of this object, and then press Shift and S and move my cursor to that selection. Then back in object mode, I'm going to bring everything back with Alt and H, and I'm going to drop my selection, and then I'm going to press Shift A for the add menu, and this time I'm going to make an empty object, and I'm going to use a cube. And what happens with that is it's just a temporary object. It's just a placeholder, if you like. So I'm going to use that as a way of grouping my strut objects so I can duplicate them and then copy them over to the other side of the scene. So before I do that, I want to extend the conveyor belt along this tunnel as well. So I'm going to repeat the process that I did earlier. I'm going to hide my cavern for the moment. And then I'm going to select this object at the end and just frame my selection so that my viewport rotates a bit easier. And I'm going to select this track object and hide everything else with Shift and H. And I'm going to change my snap setting so that I'm back to increment. And then I'm going to duplicate this along the x-axis. So I'm going to press Alt and D and then X and hold Control and just snap a copy. And then do Shift and R and repeat that. And then I'm going to press Alt and H and bring everything back. And then select this strut. And then go into wireframe so I can see what's going on. And repeat that process. So Alt and D, X, Control, and then Shift and R. And then I'm going to select the force field object. And I'm just going to hide this one at the end for the moment to make the snapping easier. And then change my snapping back to vertex. So in edit mode for this, I've got a selection over here, so I want to drop that selection and Control Tab into edge mode and select the edges at the end of this force field object, and then press E again and then X this time, and then holding Control I'm going to snap it to the end of that track object there. And then again, as before, I'm going to do this in solid view. I'm going to press Control and R and create a loop cut, and then click and right click to leave it in the center. So when I go back into object mode and bring everything back with Alt and H, I'm now ready to place my duplicates using the empty as a guide to snap it to the end of this conveyor belt here. So back at the other end of the conveyor then, I want to select all of my struts, and then I want to select the empty, and then I want to parent these to the empty with Control and P and choose object. And then with them all still selected, I can press Alt and D to create a linked duplicate, and then right click and leave that in place. And then I can select one of the empties, and I want to snap this to the other end of the conveyor belt. So I've got my vertex snap set, and so what I can do is zoom in so I can see what's going on, and then press G and then hold Control and then snap that to the center of the force field strip object there. And then in my top view, I'm going to go into ortho with 5 on the keypad. I want to rotate this around 90 degrees. So I'm going to do R90, and they're now nicely placed at the other end of the conveyor belt. So next I'm going to bring back my cavern again and unlock it, and I'm just going to frame my current selection, which is this empty, and as before I need to adjust the tunnel here to work better with these strut objects. I'm just going to go into perspective mode and frame my selection again, and I want to select the cavern object and go into sculpting mode, and in my tools I'm going to enable dynamic topology, and as before I just want to use the standard sculpt draw brush with smooth and control just to push this geometry back and expose some of these objects and just generally tidy things up here. Okay, so I think that's fine. I've shown all of the objects and I haven't changed the cavern too much there, but I think that looks pretty good now. So the next section down on my model list is the pipe section, and I've got this valve wheel here. So looking at the concept, I have what's going to be a fairly simple torus object, which is this valve, and then it's attached to the pipe with this extra thick collar of pipe here. So I'm going to make that next. So I've shown my pipes layer, and I've highlighted the pipe segment that I want the valve to be part of. So I'm going to begin by duplicating this with Shift and D, and then right clicking and leaving it in place. And next I want to change the geometry a little bit, so I'm going to go into edit mode, and I want to create some edge loops in the center of these segments here. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R and create a loop, and then right click and leave it in the center there, and then do the same on the other side. And next I want to Alt and right click on the edge loop in the center, and then press Ctrl and plus to expand that selection and have these edges in the center all selected. And next I can press Ctrl and I and then press X and then delete those edges. So now I've just got these faces in the center. So next I want to give this some thickness. So I'm going to press A and select everything, and then press Alt and E and then choose Region Vertex Normals. And as before, I can hold down Shift to give me finer control. And I just want to give it some thickness, like that. And then I want to scale this in a little bit on the Y-axis so that it's got a bit of an angle at the ends of the object here. So I'm going to press S and then Y, and just move that into something like there. Okay, next I want to repeat this loop cut process. So I'm going to drop my current selection and then press Ctrl and R and then create a loop cut and right click to leave it in the center of that segment, and then do the same on the other side. And then I want to Alt and right click the central edge loop again, and then press Ctrl and plus to expand that selection. And then again I can press Alt and E and then choose Region Vertex Normals, and again just bring that out to give it a bit more thickness there. And again, as before, I want to scale this on the Y-axis, so S and then Y, and then just bring that down to somewhere like that. Okay, next I want to go into object mode on this, and then press Shift and H and hide everything else. And if I just frame this selection, I want to remove all of the interior faces because I don't need them. So back in edit mode, I'm going to drop my current selection and then go into face mode. And then if I Alt and right click on one of these horizontal edges, it will select this band of polygons here. And then I can add to that selection with Shift and Alt and select all of those as well, and then delete them with X. Next I want to make some sharp edges, so I'm going to go into edge mode, and I want to Alt and right click and Shift and Alt and right click all of the edge loops that I want to mark as sharp. And then I'm going to press Ctrl E and mark sharp. And if you look at it in object mode now, the settings were already set on that pipe segment before for auto smooth and smooth, so it looks the way I expect it to now. Okay, next I want to make the wheel for the valve. So I'm going to go back into edit mode and then vertex mode and drop my current selection. And then I want to select this vertex in the center at the front of the object, and then press Shift and S and move the cursor to that point. Then back in object mode, I want to go into my side view and ortho, and then I want to create a torus at this point here. So I'm going to press Shift and A and then do Mesh Torus. And if I expand the options out here, I want to align it to my view, and I want to reduce the geometry quite a bit, I think. So I'm going to change the minor segments to, let's try 6, and I want to change the major segments to 12. And then the scale of it is much too large at the moment, so I'm going to change the major radius to something quite small. Let's try, I'm not really sure, let's try 0.4. And at this stage I can go into wireframe to get a better idea about how big it is in relation to the other object. I'm just going to change the minor radius a little bit, so let's change that to 0.05. Maybe that's a bit too small, but we'll change the major radius first. I want to make it a little bit smaller, so 0.2. No, that's too small. 0.3. I think that's okay. And at that size, I think the minor radius is okay as well. I'm just going to check it in a solid view. Yeah, it could be a little bit thicker, I think. So I'm going to change the minor radius to 0.06. Yeah, I think that will do. Okay, so with that done, I want to move this on the x-axis and just move it out of the way of this valve object here. And then I want to go to my Tools tab and make the object smooth. So next I want to make a cylinder, which will be the axle that this wheel turns on. So back in my side view, and again I'm going to do this in wireframe, I'm going to press Shift and A and make a cylinder, and again have it aligned to my view, and I want to change the vertices value to something quite low, so let's try 6. I want to change the radius so that it sits nicely in the center of this wheel. Let's just change that to 0.1. And I don't mind too much about the depth. I'm going to change that in edit mode in a moment. I think that's okay. So back in my solid view, I'm going to go into edit mode and then face mode. I'm just going to grab this face and move it up so that it's just inside, it's just embedded in this object here, something like that. Okay, so now that I've got that in place, I don't need it anymore, so I can press X and delete it. And next I want to select the one at the other end, something like that. I want to bring that down. I'm just going to do this in my front view so I can see what's going on. And I want it so that it's just inside the bounding box of the wheel. Something like that is okay, I think. And next I want to extrude this face, so I'm going to press E and then extrude it up so that it's about the same distance from the other side of the torus. Okay, so back in solid view, I've now got this band of polygons going around this cylinder. So I want to drop my current selection and then press Alt and right click on one of the horizontal edges to select all of the faces in that loop. And then I can press Alt and E and this time choose individual faces. So when it extrudes them out, it separates them. And I just want to get it so that they're just inside, just embedded into the wheel. And next I want to scale these faces down so that the spokes are tapered. So I'm going to change my pivot point to individual origins. So when I press S, it will scale them all in place. I think something like that. And now that that's done, I don't need those faces anymore, so I can press X and delete them. Okay, so next I want to add some smoothing to this object. So I'm going to go into edge mode and I want to select the edge ring that goes around this cylindrical shape. So I'm going to press Ctrl and Alt and right click on one of the edges, and then I'm going to invert that selection with Ctrl and I, and I'm going to mark those edges as sharp. So Ctrl and E and mark sharp. So next, before I go back to object mode, I want to fix this n-gon at the front, and I could select it and poke it into triangles. What I'm going to do this time is go into vertex mode and then drop my current selection and then just select these vertices and then press J to join them together. Okay, so back in object mode then, I want to enable auto smooth and I want to make the object smooth. So this cylinder is nice and round and all of the spokes have these angles in place. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the valve, and now it's time to move on to the next object. So the next thing to make on my model list is this power cable, which is this quite fat cable at the bottom here connecting the machine to the wall of the cavern. And there's also a wall socket, this sort of cylindrical socket here, and there's also one attaching the cable to the machine. So I have my machine layer visible and it's the active layer. So what I want to do first is move my 3D cursor to be roughly at this point here against the cavern wall. So I'm just going to click and that will put it roughly in the right place. And I'm going to start with the cylinder for the wall socket. So I'm going to press Shift and A and then do Mesh, Cylinder. And I want to align it to my view, but I'm in a perspective view at the moment. So I'm going to go into Side View and then Ortho. And I want to align it to view and then change the radius to something a bit bigger, something more like that. And then I want to give it a few more sides because I think it needs to be a bit more round. So I'm going to make that, let's try 12. I think that will do. And next I want to just position this a bit better against the cavern wall. So I'm going to bring this out along the x-axis and it's a little big. So I might scale that down again. I'm just going to go into perspective mode and frame my selection. So I'm going to scale this down to something like that and then lower it so that it's not overlapping the pipe. And I think that's not too bad. So I'm going to have it embedded into the wall, and then I'm going to go into edit mode and then face mode and then select this face at the front and then just move it a bit further back. So looking back at the concept, the socket is made up of two parts. I've got a wider part and a more narrow one there. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to inset this face with I and just bring that down and then extrude it out with E to something like that. And then I want to expand the selection with Control and plus, and then again, so all of these faces at the front are selected, and for now I just want to move it further back closer to the wall. And I think the object could do with being a bit bigger. The cable is quite thick in the concept and I want that chunkiness to come through in my object, so I may end up reshaping the cavern a little bit to accommodate this, but for now I'll leave it at this size and I can change it later. Okay, so going back to the object then, I want to select the face at the front and then press Alt and P to poke that face into triangles, and then I want to go into edge mode and I want to Alt and right click the edge loops that I'd like to make sharp, and then Shift and Alt, and then press Control and E and mark sharp. And then back in object mode, I'm going to enable smoothing with auto smooth and the smooth option in the tool tab. And this face at the back I don't really need, but I'll leave it there for now. In fact, I'm going to go into edit mode and go into face mode and poke that into triangles as well, Alt and P. And then in edge mode, I'm actually going to make that sharp as well. So I'm going to do Control E on that and mark sharp. And the reason I've done this, even though it's embedded in the wall, is that I'm going to duplicate this object and embed it in the base of the machine to be the socket over here. So I'm going to first of all go into vertex mode, and I'd like the pivot of the object, the origin, to be at this vertex here, which is why I poked it into triangles. So I'm going to go and select that in the center and then press Shift and S and then move cursor to selected. And then in object mode, I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C and move origin to 3D cursor. So with that done, I'm going to duplicate this object and move it over towards the machine. So Shift and D and then X, and then just move it over here. And then I'll frame the selection with my decimal point key. And I want to just quickly check the concept and see what the socket over here looks like. And it's pretty similar, but maybe this cylindrical section is a bit shorter on this one. So I'm going to go back in and then I'm going to go into edit mode and drop my current selection, go to wireframe so I can box select the vertices at the front and then just move those down so that this wider section here is a bit shorter. Okay, so back in object mode, I'm going to move this so that it's more appropriately placed, something like that. And I'm just eyeballing this. I'm not too worried about the exact positioning of it. As long as it looks like it's attached properly to the machine, I think that's what we'll do. In fact, actually, if I go to my layers tab and hide my cavern, I'm just going to go into wireframe. I'm going to snap it to this edge in the base of the machine. So I'm going to hold Control and then click on the Y arrow on the gizmo and just snap it to there. Okay, so back in solid view, I just want to reposition this a bit better so that this wide section is clear of the base of the machine, and I think something like that will be okay. Okay, so I'm going to bring back the cavern and then make the machine layer my active layer again, and now I need to create a curve object which will link these two objects together. Okay, so with both of these sockets visible, I'm going to change my pivot point back to median, and next I want to create a curve to join these two sockets together. So I'm going to press Shift and A and then do curve, Bezier, and I'm just going to move it over here. And next I want to snap the ends of this curve to the sockets. So I'm going to go into edit mode and I want to select the vertex at either end and then press G and then hold Control and snap it to the vertex in the center of each socket. So I'm going to go to the other end and then press G, Control and then snap. Okay, so back in object mode, I'm going to come over here to the data context and I'm going to change my fill mode to full and then add some value to the bevel depth, and also This is very low resolution, it's only got 4 sides, so I'm going to change the resolution to, let's try 2. I think it will do for now, I can change it later. So now I want to give this cable some nicer shape. I'm just going to quickly look back at the concept. There is kind of a bend in the cable here, so I want to represent that. So first of all, I'm going to do this in my top view. I'm going to press 7 on my keypad and then 5 for ortho view, so I've got a nice clean view of it. And before I begin adding shape, I want to make sure that the ends of the cable are nicely flush with the socket object. So if I go into wireframe and then edit mode, what I can do, instead of just eyeballing this by moving the handles, I can select the vertex at the end and then scale that on the y-axis. So I can press S, Y, and then type 0, and now that's nicely aligned and the handles are straight. And if I look at the other end, I think that one's actually already there, so I don't need to scale that one. And next what I want to do is select both of the vertices, so both of them at either end, and I want to add a new vertex in the center. So if I come over here to my Tools tab, I'm just going to expand my options here. What I can do is click Subdivide, and that will add an extra vertex in the center of the curve. So I can drop my selection and then select that vertex, and I can make changes to the curve knowing that the cable end will be still flush with the socket object. So I'm just going to make some changes and make something that I think works and looks nice. And I may need to change the handles at the ends here, and just want to make something that looks a bit more like the concept. So I think this handle here is maybe a bit short. I think something like that looks okay. And with it being a curve, I can always make further changes if I need to. I'm just going to go back to my solid view, and I want to make it so that the cable's a bit thicker. I need to make it so that it's not too big for the socket that's embedded in the wall, but if need be I can change the size of that object quite easily. So I'm going to go to my bevel depth and just scroll up so that it's almost as full as that socket there. And going back to the concept, it is fairly close to the edge of that socket, but there's a bit more clearance here. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to go to object mode, and then I'm going to scale this object on the Y and the Z. So I'm going to press S and then Shift X so that it locks out the X-axis scaling, and then just scale it up a little bit like that. Okay, so on the other side, I think this socket here is about the right size, so I'm going to leave that one where it is, and I think that's probably it. I'm going to press Alt and H and bring everything back and drop my selection and just see how that looks in the scene, and yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So back to my model list then. I've only got this light fixture left to make, and there are quite a few light fixtures in the scene. Each of these track struts has one at the corners, but I'm not going to make an object for those. I'm going to include that detail on the texture, and the same for this horizontal strut here. The light fixtures that are on this part of the machine here, on this torus, I'm actually going to make a bit of geometry for that because it's part of this detailed central focal point of the scene. So I'm going to make that next. So here I've just got my machine layer visible, and I'm going to box select the objects at the top here and then hide everything else with Shift and H. And what I want to do is temporarily rotate these objects so that these parts here are lying nicely along the grid. If I go into my top view, you can see that these rotations that we've added mean that these objects are off grid, and it'll be easier for the next step if I can rotate them so that this object is lying nicely along the y-axis line. So what I'm going to do first, the main trunk object of the machine is the parent for all of these other ones. And so what I'm going to do is go up to the rotation value here, which is currently set to this value, and I want to apply that so that becomes 0. So I'm going to press Ctrl and A and then apply that rotation. So that now gets zeroed out. And what I want to do is work out how many degrees I need to rotate this to make this object lie along this line. So I'm using the torus for this. I'm going to go into my wireframe view, and I know that each of these segments is 11.25 degrees. So to make this lie along that line, I need to rotate it 1, 2, 3.5 segments. So going back to my main parent object, I can go to my Z rotation field and then type in negative 11.25 multiplied by 3.5. And now that's nicely placed along that line. So next I want to go back to my ortho view and solid mode and then select this object and go into edit mode. And first of all I want to select the vertex that's in the center at the front of the object and then press Shift and S and move my cursor to that selection. So back in object mode, I'm going to go into my front view for this and frame my selection. I just want to make a cylinder here, so I'm going to press Shift and A and do Mesh Cylinder. And in my options, I want to align it to view and then scale the object right down, something like there I think, perhaps even a bit smaller. Let's change that to 0.1. And it's quite a small object, so it has to be really simple. So I'm going to change the vertices value to 8. And I want to change the cap type to triangle fan. So next I want to go into edit mode on this, and I'll go into wireframe, and I want to go into face mode and drop my current selection, and I now want to select all of the faces on the left hand side. So I'm going to box select those, and then I'm going to extrude these along the x-axis, so I'm going to press E and then create this kind of capsule shape. Okay, next I want to scale the cylinder in. It's too long obviously, so I'm going to go back into wireframe and vertex mode and then select all of the vertices at the back and just move those forwards so that they're embedded in this object still, something like that. And then I want to invert my selection and pull these almost all the way down. I'm going to reshape this a little bit later on, but for now that will do. And next I want to select everything, so I'm going to press A twice, and I want to center this on the 3D cursor, so I can press Shift and S and then move selection to cursor but with offset, which will maintain the positions of all of the vertices but center it on the 3D cursor. So with that done, I'm going to go into edge mode and then drop my selection and then Alt and right click on the edge loop at the front and then press Ctrl and B for bevel and just bevel it in a little bit, something like that. And I don't really need this much geometry here, but I want this kind of bevel to be visible at the front, so I'm going to Alt and right click the edge loop in the center there and then press X and then dissolve those edges. So I've still got this kind of pointed area, but it's still very simple. So next I need to select all of the vertices at the front and move them further back. So I'm going to go into vertex mode and then select them all and just bring them back to somewhere like there. Okay, so back in edge mode, I'm going to Alt and right click this edge loop at the front and then press Ctrl and E and mark sharp. And I've still got some faces inside this object, so back in object mode I'm going to press Shift and H and hide everything else, and then back in edit mode I'm going to select all of the faces at the back and then delete them. Okay, so back in object mode and solid view, I'm going to apply auto smooth and smoothing, and that's okay. So bringing everything back, I'm going to press Alt and H, and I want to parent this new object to my trunk object here. So I'm going to first of all select it and then select the trunk object and then press Ctrl and P and then choose the object option. And next I want to rotate a copy of this around the center of the world. So I'm going to put my 3D cursor back to the origin with Shift and C. And so I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C and move my origin to the 3D cursor. And next I want to duplicate a copy of this and rotate it 123.75 degrees. So I'm going to press Alt and D and then R, Z, negative 123.75. So that's created a copy and placed it in the proper place. So I can then press Shift and R and rotate another copy into that place there. And these are all already parented to the main trunk object. So next what I want to do is have these all selected. And I want to duplicate copies here and move them down here. So I'm going to select these objects as well so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to hide everything else. And in order to snap these properly, what I want to do is select the light fixtures and move the origins back to the center of each of these objects. So again, I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C and move origin to geometry. So next I want to press Alt and D again to create these copies, and I'm going to press Z to restrict it to the Z axis, and then holding Control I'm going to snap to the center of these objects here. And again, all of these are already parented to the main machine object. So bringing everything back again, I'm going to press Alt and H and I can select my main trunk object, and from before we've got this rotation value set. So to rotate everything back to the proper place, I can just click in that field and 0 that value, and it's taken all of the light fixtures with that rotation. The final bit of modelling I want to do is to extend the tunnels of the cavern. At the moment they're kind of just ending with a flat wall, so I want to extend these off around a corner and then have the conveyor belt go around that corner to suggest that there's a wider environment. So next I'm going to hide the cavern layer and the machine layer, and then I'm going to hide this force field object so I can see what's going on underneath. And what I want to do is duplicate the objects that make up this corner. And before I duplicate them, I want to create an empty at the center of the world where the 3D cursor is and parent those objects to that empty. So I'm going to press Shift and A and create a new empty. I'll use a cube again. And then I want to select these objects. And then I want to duplicate those with Alt and D and right click to leave them in place. And then I can Shift and click the empty object and then press Ctrl and P for the parent menu and parent those together. So next what I want to do is select this empty. I'll do this in my top view and ortho with 5 on my keypad, and I want to snap this copy of these objects over here to meet the end of the track. So I'm going to change my snap element to increment, and then holding Control I'm just going to get it roughly in the right place. And I want this group to be rotated so that the corner is going up here. So I'm going to press R for rotate and then -90, and then zooming in I can just snap that into place. Okay, so now I want to duplicate this group and put it at the other end of the conveyor belt. So in order to select all of the objects that are parented to this object, what I can do is press Shift and G, and that will bring up the Select Grouped menu, and I can choose Children. And now they're all selected, I can Shift and right click on the empty, and then press Alt and D, and then right click and leave those in place. So now I can select this empty and do the same thing, hold Control, and then snap that roughly into place. And then zoom in. And this time I want the curve of this track corner to go this way to the right. So I'm going to press R 180 so that it's going that way. And as before I can hold Control and then snap this group into place. Okay, so with that done, I do have some struts here that I've got duplicated on top of each other. So I can just select one of them and then press X and delete it. And then I can do the same at the other end of the conveyor. And now I'm ready to reshape the cavern around these objects. So I'm going to show my cavern layer and then select the cavern itself. And all I want to do is extend this tunnel off to the right and then make it turn a corner to accommodate this new track object. So what I'm going to do is go into Edit Mode and then Vertex Mode. And then in Wireframe, I'm going to select all of the vertices that make up the end of this tunnel and then move them off just to the right of this new track object. And as you can see, that movement's created a lot of stretched faces, but we can fix those with the sculpting tools. And in this case, rather than as before where we've positioned the viewport camera inside the cavern and worked from within, what I'm going to do to speed things up is to flip the normals of the object and work from the outside. So what I'm going to do is press A twice to select everything, and then I can press Ctrl and F and then choose flip normals from the face menu. And if you look at it in solid view now and in object mode, you can see that the cavern is kind of inside out, and I can sculpt on it as a normal object now. So I'm going to switch to sculpt mode, and then in my tools tab I'm going to enable dynamic topology, and I want to subdivide these stretched faces, but I don't want to really create any different shapes. I just want to divide this geometry up nicely. So what I'm going to do is reduce the strength of my brush to 0, and so that won't create any shapes, but it will subdivide the geometry as I paint strokes over the object. So to begin with, I want to change my detail size to something else. It's a bit too small, I think. So I'm going to sample something around the center of the object, which is about 10. And if I go into wireframe so you can see what's going on, I'm just going to draw over this object, and you can see that it's not changing the shape that much really, but it is nicely dividing this into triangles. So I'm going to go over this whole area and just break up all of these long thin faces that we've got. Something like that. Okay, so for the next part I want to go back into my top view, and I want to do this in wireframe so I can see the conveyor belt underneath. And from sculpting mode I can press tab and go into edit mode from there. So I'm going to drop my current selection, and I just want to select some of the vertices from about this point, roughly in the middle of the curve of the track, and all the way to the end. So I'm just going to press B and box select, say to about there. And we can reshape this later. This is going to create a very rough blocked out kind of a shape. So I want to move those up, and again that's created these kind of stretched faces. So I can press tab and go back to sculpt mode, but when I leave sculpt mode dynamic topology is switched off, so I need to remember to enable that. So I'm going to enable it and then do the same thing, just drawing over all of these longer faces to reduce them down to triangles. Something like that. So looking at it in solid view, I've got this kind of L shape now, and I can refine this shape and make it look a bit more appropriate, a bit more cavern-like, but that's a decent first step. So next I'm going to repeat this process for the other end of the conveyor belt. I'm going to go back into my top view and focus in on this end instead. And what I can do next is go into wireframe and then tab into edit mode, and I'm going to make sure I don't have any selections by pressing A. And then I can press B and box select all of the vertices at this end on this tunnel and move those up so that they're just above this track object here. And then going back into sculpting mode, I can re-enable dynamic topology and paint over this area. Something like that. And then back in my top view I can do the same thing, go back into edit mode, drop my current selection, and then box select the vertices to around this point here, and then move those over on the x-axis. And then back in sculpting mode, enable dynamic topology, and then paint out those long faces. Okay, so I've now got my basic shape for the ends of these tunnels, and now I just need to refine them to make them look a bit more natural. Okay, so what I want to do is basically knock off the corners of these shapes. They're very angular and regular looking. So before I flip the normals back and work on the inside of the cavern as before, I'm just going to use my smooth and my standard brush, my sculptural brush, to round off these corners. So to do that I need to change my strength. I'm going to put that back to about halfway. And then I'm going to use Shift and Control just to push them in and make them look a bit more rounded and a bit less regular. And it doesn't matter if the conveyor belt ends up sticking out at a certain point at this stage. I'll be going in and fixing that stuff next. Okay, I think that will do for that end. I'm just going to go and do the other side now. Something like that, I think. So for the next section, I want to flip the normals of the cavern back inside and then work from within to get the shapes that I want to look right in the interior of these curved sections. So I'm going to tab into edit mode again and then press A twice to select everything. And as before, I'm going to press Ctrl and F for the faces menu and then flip the normals. So now I can drop my current selection, and I'm just going to box select some vertices roughly in the area that I'd like to work in, and then I'm going to press the decimal point key on my keypad so that I'm framed nicely in this area, and then I can press tab and go back into sculpting mode, and now I'm ready to reshape this area from within. So I'm going to enable dynamic topology again, and I just want to make sure that there's no encroachment of the cavern onto the conveyor belt sections as in here, and just to generally roughen this up and make it look more like the rest of the cavern. So I'm going to make my brush a bit larger and then reshape this area. So as before, when we were doing the cavern sculpting, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but I'd like to make some rocky-like extrusions and ridges and just generally make it look like it fits in with the rest of the scene. I think that'll do for the end of that tunnel. So I just want to repeat the process at the other side of the scene. I'm going to go over to this section here, and if I zoom in and just repeat the process, making sure that the cavern doesn't encroach on the conveyor belt. That's the most important thing. And again, as before, just making some rocky ridge type shapes to make it look natural. And here and there I'm zooming outwards into the tunnel just to get an idea about what my changes look like from outside, and just making the most of these areas. Next, I want to add some extra detail to my conveyor belt to match these new corners I've just made. So I'm going to go into object mode, and then I'm going to go to my layers tab and hide the cavern. And I want to press Alt and H to bring back the force field object that I hid earlier. And then I want to select it, and then select these new track objects, and then press decimal point on my number pad, and select these other two corner pieces, and then hide everything else with Shift and H. And what I want to do is duplicate these corner objects and then use that geometry to extend this force field around these corners. So I'm going to select them and then duplicate them with Shift and D and right click to leave them in place. And then I want to go to my Tools tab and choose Join so that they become one object. So next I want to go into edit mode, and with everything selected I can press A twice just to make sure. I want to scale these so that they're flat. So I'm going to press S and then Z and then 0. And next I want to snap them up so that they match the end of this force field object and they're on the same level. So I'm going to change my snap element to vertex, and then I'm going to hold Control and then click on the blue arrow and then snap it to the vertex at the end of this force field strip here. So before I join these objects together, what I want to do is create this edge loop in the center as we have in the main force field. So I'm going to press Ctrl and R and then have the pink line going around the center, and then click and then right click to leave that in place. And then I can drop my selection, and I'm just going to select the vertices at this end here and then focus on that with the decimal point key again. And then I can press Ctrl and R and create my edge loop in the center here. So click and right click. And now I want to join these objects together. So I'm going to go back to object mode and then select the main force field. And then I'm going to press join again. And then again I'm going to go into edit mode and then press A twice to select everything. And then I can press Ctrl and V for the vertex menu and then choose remove doubles. So going back into object mode, I now want to go to my layers tab and show the crystal layer. And if I just frame my current selection, you can see I've got crystals in the main area, but now I've got quite empty parts here on the conveyor belt. So I'm going to create some extra duplicates of my crystals to fill that up a little bit. So as before, I'm just going to go back to my top view and then put myself in ortho view with 5 on the keypad. and I just want to create some extra copies of each of the crystals and rocks and just extend this row of objects along here. So I'm going to press Shift and D and then just move them around. And as before, I can press R twice to have my trackball rotation. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. So duplicate and move these up. And you may not see these in a standard render from the camera that we're going to set up, but if you were to take renders from different angles, it's nice to know that you've got detail going all the way to the background. So I'm going to duplicate again. And one thing I've realized while I'm here with the crystals layer is that I've got my reference objects on this layer, and what I would like to do is select all of those, and I'm going to go to my layers tab, and I'm just going to move those to the ref cube layer where my reference pipe objects are. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the modeling section. I think it's looking pretty good compared to the concept. And one thing I'd like to do at this stage before moving on is to look around the view in first person. So I can do that by pressing Shift and F, and that will give me this crosshair, and then I can press G to simulate gravity, and then using the W, A, S and D keys I can just walk around this environment as if I'm a character inside it. And as well as being just kind of cool, this is also quite useful to look at things from a different angle than you're used to, and perhaps find something that is amiss that you want to correct. For example, the cavern could be encroaching on an object in a way that I didn't intend. So have a good look around, and when you're ready you can right click and that will put you back to where you started. And then we're ready to move on to the next section, which is unwrapping and texturing.
Hi, AD Boris here, just wrapping it all up. Many thanks to Martin for taking us through this beginner modeling environments course, and many thanks for sticking with us, and of course congratulations for making it to the end. There is another texturing section almost finished which follows on from this, which covers all of the UV unwrapping, baking, painting, material setup and more for that matter, and we hope you'll join us then.